Good afternoon, everyone. This is Mike O'Malley here with the Hurricane Outlook and discussion for August 17th, 2021 at around 3 p.m. Eastern Time. We have a lot to talk about today, including the potential for Tropical Storm Grace to become a major hurricane over the next several days, and a look at Tropical Storm Henri and the threat that it could pose down the road to portions of the northeastern United States over the next several days. So let's go and jump straight into everything. Taking a wide look across the tropical Atlantic this afternoon, again, we have Tropical Depression Fred that again made landfall as a strong tropical storm with maximum sustained winds of 65 to 70 miles per hour yesterday. That is now moving inland over Georgia, still causing some problems with tornadoes and heavy rainfall and flooding. This will become less of a concern over the next several days as it generally heads off towards the north and east and weakens with time. Again, all the forecasting here is done. This is now inland. So the main focus now will be on these two systems right here. We have Tropical Storm Grace located inland over Jamaica and Tropical Storm Henri about 100 miles to the southeast of Bermuda. And both of these pose at least some concern going down the road, with Grace being the most ominous concern over the next several days. So starting off here again from west to east, looking at Tropical Storm Grace. Again, right now, sustained winds are roughly at about 50 miles per hour, and again, we have seen some gradual intensification. This is likely now inland over Jamaica, which means that intensification will likely be halted at least for a little while. This is expected to come off of Jamaica within probably the next several hours even. And then intensification will likely resume once this comes off, expected to become a hurricane over the next 24 hours. So by tomorrow, this should be a hurricane crossing over the Yucatan Peninsula and regaining hurricane intensity in the Bay of Campeche. Now, looking here at the visible satellite imagery, we can tell that we've had a lot of things going on today with Grace. First of all, we have more centralized convection than what we have had over the last several days. We noticed that there's a large pool of air that's been drawing in from the storm. And what this really tells us that we have a more well-defined low-level circulation than what we've had over the last several days. And in fact, we can see that, again, we have more organized banding. This is where the central convection is at the moment. So the low-level center is likely somewhere over the northern part of Jamaica. We have banding on both sides here and here. So this indicates that, again, we have a very well-organized low-level circulation drawing in air from very far away, especially on the western side. You can see all this air that Grace is beginning to pull in, which means that this has a very healthy environment going forward. Based on the latest recon plane that was in there from earlier, again, they found a central pressure of about 1,006, and they found a lot of easterly winds here very close to the coast, indicating that the low-level circulation likely moved inland over northern Jamaica, and this is now beginning to move generally west or northwest. So it's taking a track over the northern part of the island of Jamaica. Now, this is a lot better than as opposed to coming over the southern part where the mountains are very high in through here, well over about 5,000 feet, and I've been to some of them, and they're quite tall. This indicates that, again, that the storm is going to have a better time surviving, although the inner core structure that was in there from earlier has obviously degraded. But again, the recon found multiple winds here, multiple flight level and surface winds of 45 to 50 miles per hour. And for that reason, that is why the Hurricane Center upgraded this to 50 miles per hour. So what's Grace going to be doing over the next several days? Well, it's kind of still a little bit complicated, but the track forecast has become a lot more certain over the next several days. This is the GFS forecast, the lower level vorticity at 850 millibars. This is the 12Z run valid for 2 p.m. this afternoon. Again, here is Grace at the moment. There's Fred and Henri, which we'll be talking about Henri here in a moment. But again, one of the main things that we'll be watching for is where exactly does Grace come off at. And again, right now, it seems like this low-level circulation will likely come off a bit to the north, and likely this launching point then would be a bit north, such that this may indeed track over the northern part of the Hurricane Center forecast cone at the moment. So there could be some slight adjustments that's needed towards the northern part here of the Yucatan Peninsula within the next several days. But again, what's going to be happening here is we have a broad upper level ridge in the mid levels of the atmosphere that will be setting up. steering the storm generally out of the west. And we can kind of go up to the 500 millibar vorticity here to see this. Again, here's this ridge that's setting up right now, and this is generally steering the storm towards the west-northwest at the moment. And over the next several days, the atmosphere is going to be very prime for development here and intensification, perhaps rapidly, once this clears Jamaica. And again, the environment is consisting of very high sea surface temperatures and consisting of very warm upper ocean heat content. And also a fairly moist environment. We can actually look at this here in the relative humidity plot. That again, we do have a little bit of dry air, and this is because there's a trough here, this short upper level trough, and we can kind of tell if we go back to the water vapor imagery, we can tell that there is an upper level trough that is impacting our storm right now, and we can kind of see a little sliver of this upper level trough here. This has been imparting just a little bit of westerly shear over top of the storm during the last several days. Not really been enough to keep shear going sufficiently high, but if you look at where the storm is currently, there's a lot of moisture off towards the eastern side of it, but it's not enough to continue to hinder up shear convection, meaning that we get storms rotating in the opposite direction counter to the shear direction. And because of this, that basically means that thunderstorms are able to propagate up shear and moisten the downstream environment for the circulation, which means as it passes over this area, all this dry air right now will get eventually pushed out of the way, and this little short wave, or this little trough here that's digging in, will begin to split in two pieces during the next several days. So we will have a little bit of dry air to the north here, which again, may have a little bit of a time trying to get wrapped around, but the inner core structure itself is very moist and protected, and that's one of the reasons why here in the GFS, at least, this gets to near hurricane intensity, and again, this will likely, the global models have a harder time resolving intensity more so than the hurricane-specific models. So the bottom line here is that a 992 pressure could end up being something like a 974 pressure, given the fact that this is, again, not a high spatial resolution to forecast the dynamical processes in a tropical cyclone. But by and large, again, this dry air will be sufficiently far ahead of it where it's probably not going to get wrapped around, fairly sufficient moisture. And again, the 500 millibar heights here, again, we can kind of see that eventually, once this crosses the Yucatan Peninsula, now we've begun to kind of rule out the potential that this would be impacting any part of the United States. It looks a little bit less likely today, or a lot less likely, that we'll have a storm that clips the southern part of Texas here. It looks a little bit less likely today that that is going to happen. One of the reasons for that is we have this ridge building over top of the Gulf Coast here, which is going to be forcing a storm generally west or even southwest with time, and that's what happens on the GFS. And now on the GFS here, again, we get a weaker storm because of that land interaction and just because it's the spatial resolution of it. But eventually this ridge here is basically connected all within one. You get you basically get a southeasterly or southwesterly steering component rather, and that forces a storm into Mexico. So we're likely not to see a storm that's going to come up and go into Texas. I don't think that's going to happen. Unfortunately, that means we won't get chase plans, but fortunately, it means that, again, the United States won't have to worry about this, but when one person doesn't have to worry about it, another one does, and in this case, it will be coastal Mexico, that unfortunately could take a brunt of a very significant hurricane that will be in this region within the next 5 days or so. Again, the upper air environment, we can take a look here at the HWRF for this forecast. Again, we can see this broad upper level trough here. And again, this is just imparting a little bit of shear over top of the storm, but it's not enough. Now, we do have a big upper level ridge here, but this is also going to begin to break down and propagate towards the northeast and away from the storm. And now what we'll notice here is that on the HWRF forecast, this is the 12Z run, by the way, we get a hurricane by tomorrow morning, 988 millibars. We see this big ridge of high pressure out here, but again, this upper level anticyclone is now going to be interacting with some of this and begin to really take away from this upper level ridge here. And we notice that, again, it kind of begins to shift and break down. We get the storm scale anticyclone over the storm, and that allows for some rather significant deepening. And then we're looking at sometime early Thursday morning that we could be looking at a landfall. Now, currently, the official Hurricane Center forecast has landfall within about the next 2 days or so, and then crossing over. And by day 5 here, the actual forecast point is for a tropical depression to be over parts of extreme western Cuba. Some of the remnant energy may in fact make it to the eastern Pacific, but I don't expect development or redevelopment there. But again, this moves into the Bay of Campeche eventually, but it crosses the Yucatan here. Still, it will weaken, and here on the GFS or on the HWRF, this maintains hurricane intensity, re-deepens it, and on the HWRF forecast, it makes landfall about 948 millibars. Not a completely unreasonable solution, given the fact that there will be some very decent conditions throughout the entire lifetime of Grace as it now begins to pull away from Jamaica. And once it really does so, it's all off to the races. Now, again, a lot is going to depend on the exact intensity here when it makes the first landfall, because, again, that's going to determine a lot. And whether or not we actually can build an inner core really quick, rebuild that inner core that was there earlier, quickly after moving off of Jamaica will be very important for determining the intensity here at first landfall, and then determining the second intensity down there. So bottom line is we'll be looking at a pretty strong storm. The European, which has been notoriously underdoing the storm, is now also further south, but it is much stronger, and again generally consists of a much stronger cyclone. So the bottom line is for our friends, first of all, in the Yucatan Peninsula, the Cayman Islands even, we could be dealing with a hurricane approaching that area within the next 2 days or so. Obviously, for the Cayman Islands, it's a little bit quicker, but we could be looking at a stronger hurricane than currently forecast by the Hurricane Center within the next 2 days across portions of the Yucatan Peninsula. Where exactly is to be determined based on the launching point of where this comes off exactly of Jamaica. And then eventually, for our friends here in coastal Mexico, we could be looking at another significant hurricane landfall within the next 3 or 4 days. So keep your guard up for that, and stay tuned to your local Weather Service office and government officials for the latest up-to-date information for your specific area. Now, shifting focus here, we'll take a look here at Tropical Storm Henri. Again, sustained winds have now increased to 60 miles per hour, and a pressure down to about 1,000 millibars. The storm has been moving consistently south of the forecast for the last several days. And in fact, now it's become a little bit more of a concern for our folks here in the southeast U.S. and the northeastern United States. And again, one of the reasons for that, it's just been moving south of current forecast. And the further south this gets in the short term, the broader turning radius that this has to encompass there. So the greater the threat that's going to accompany the southeast and the northeastern United States over the next several days will be where exactly this turns. Because if it turns, in the angle of it, but if it turns too far south, this could end up on a collision course for somewhere along the southeast or northeast United States at this time. Now, looking here at the visible satellite imagery, again, we notice that Henri still remains a sheared tropical cyclone. There's no doubt about that. We can tell we still have some northerly shear over top of the system, and it's not completely degrading the storm, but there's also a lot of dry air down here, which is also getting wrapped around. So a lot of what we've had today is small bursting patterns of convection, but not enough to sustain a significant deep convective burst with cloud tops over about minus 85 Celsius. And what that's kind of causing is, again, not the deepest convection in the world, but you don't need the deepest convection in the world for there to be a hurricane. Now, we can also tell that in recent hours, we seem to be getting this pulsing that is now beginning to rotate. These rotating convective bursts suggest that Henri may in fact have a very small and tight inner core structure, despite some of this dry air and northerly shear. And in fact, if we look here at the radar out of Bermuda from about 2:48 this afternoon, we noticed that this structure actually looks very similar to what we saw with Fred yesterday, in the sense that, again, here's the inner core structure, and you've got this rotating convection. Not a lot to speak of on the western side, and just like yesterday, we were dealing with Fred with not a lot here on the southeastern side. but this will likely continue intensifying for the next several days. Shear is expected to actually lessen as we go through the next 24 hours and then come back. But again, the fact that this has an attempt at this inner core structure to kind of close off, again, I'm not completely sure that this is closed off at the moment, but again, if we can get this solid ring of convection to kind of close off, this might be indicative that we're about to have a storm that could, in fact, undergo some significant intensification, much like the H-Wharf runs of the past. And we can take a look at the H-Wharf just because that is a better field of vision for what we're dealing with here. Again, the GFS and the Euro have been playing catch-up, as much of the global models have. They've been playing catch-up to how strong the storm even is. And even on the Euro here, or on the H-Wharf rather, the pressure is 1,006, and the estimated pressure from Hurricane Center is 1,000. And now we don't have recon, unfortunately, but we can take a look here at the infrared satellite. And again, it does depict where we've got that centralized convection, so it's not too far off, but again, might be underdoing it just a tad. So again, we can look here at the 200 millibar wind in the middle part of the atmosphere. What we notice is, again, we've had that northerly shear that's been impacting the storm throughout its lifetime, basically, as a tropical system. And now eventually this begins to degrade, and we get a storm that intensifies. And by tomorrow morning, we're looking at an intensifying tropical cyclone. But we also then will get a second round of this northerly shear, and the second round is going to be a little bit stronger than the first round. In fact, it's going to be double the shear amount, so we could be looking at about 15 to 20 knots of shear that is going to be across this area, and that amount of shear is just enough, and this, that this storm could be teetering on the edge of tilting over and completely decoupling and separating from its low-level circulation, where the low and mid-level sensors completely separate, and the storm would end up weakening and fading away in that environment. Now, the steering flow, though, is going to become even more interesting, though, through the next several days. We have this ridge that we talked about steering Grace, which is down here, but this ridge is also going to be responsible for steering Henri, and we also have a very complicated pattern with a shortwave trough here moving eastward, but a building ridge out across the Midwest United States moving east as well. So we can see here that on the H-Wharf, again, this takes time to really develop. And in fact, this isn't really coherent until about Friday. Now, by Friday, again, we have the shortwave energy here. We've had a shortwave trough here and another shortwave trough here moving eastward, with a building ridge over top of the system. At this point, this ridge that it was steering Grace is beginning to break down and is becoming less apparent because of this troughiness through here. Now, eventually, again, you can see here on the H-Wharf that the shortwave trough eventually picks up our storm and tries to carry it northeast. But we also have, again, this building ridge over here with another trough sliding eastward, which might pick up our storm and get it awfully close here to the Canadian Maritimes or off the coast here of the northeastern United States. And we can see that is actually represented here on the HMON forecast on the 12Z run. We'll go back to the 10-meter wind here. And again, we can see that our storm actually gets very close here to places like Long Island. And again, this is all in response because the shortwave energy here is trying to kind of pinwheel the storm generally off towards kind of the northwest, and then eventually take it back on its original trajectory. So there's a lot of uncertainty with this forecast. And again, we can kind of go back here. The H-Wharf at this time has a pretty potent hurricane, and we can look for the sea surface temperatures in this area. They would be plenty warm to support a powerful hurricane. Again, this is in the part of the world where the Gulf Stream is, and you just have a fairly good amount of sea surface temperatures in here. The upper ocean heat content is there, and it's really valid that this could become a powerful hurricane. Now, hopefully, this would stay well away from land, but you would definitely get those swells that radiate outwards towards the coastline, and eventually this would probably make it back towards Bermuda and the southeast U.S. and Florida, so that some of these swells would radiate outwards because this is a pretty potent hurricane at this point. So, again, there's a lot to watch here, but the main factor right now, the greatest land concern that I'm seeing in the short term is obviously Grace, but we can't sleep on Henri just yet. Again, the short-term trends today are going to mean a lot down the road for whether or not this is able to stay a coherent vortex or not. And I think we're about to find out within the next day or two whether or not this is going to be a real threat to the United States or the Canadian Maritimes down the road. All right. So that being said, I hope you all have a great rest of your afternoon and evening. Of course, I am Mike O'Malley. I'll talk to you guys again some more tomorrow.